So, do you ever get those moments where there's something that Jesus says or there's something that Jesus does that kind of leaves you scratching your head a little bit, kind of wondering what did he actually mean when he said that, or what did he actually intend when he did that? And I had one of those the other day, and it was Kat and I had been invited into this Zoom meeting, and it was more kind of prayerful reflection type thing, and the person leading it invited us into to reading and prayerfully reflecting upon Jesus's famous Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5, 6 and 7. And as we were doing that, these two particular passages just really stood out to me. And I think it's because that we've been discussing and talking about this idea of being holy partners in the heavenly calling, and more specifically recently we've been talking about the idea of good works, and that the idea that good works are part of the gospel, but you have to get it in the right order, that we're not saved by our good works, but that we are actually saved for our good works, that the good works are kind of the result of God's grace and God's love towards us, and they are not the cause of God's love and God's grace towards us. And so they flow out of the mercy and the goodness and the blessings that we receive. And I think I had all this kind of ruminating in the back of my mind as I was reading this, and so the two things stood out, and they're kind of two passages very close together that seem to say contradictory things. And so it began in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus tells his disciples, he says, "You are the light of the world." And then he says, "Let your light shine before men." And then just a few verses later, in the beginning of chapter 6, he seems to say the opposite, and he says, "Beware of doing your good works to be seen by men." And so it seemed on the one hand that he was saying, look, let your light shine, let your good deeds be seen by all. And then he's saying, beware of letting your good deeds or your deeds of righteousness be seen by anybody. And so it which one is it? Do we let our light shine or do we not? Do we let people see our good deeds or do we not? And just kind of sitting on this for a little bit longer, discussing it with Kat, and then kind of looking more closely at the text, it seems like one of the key ways to resolve this apparent paradox or contradiction or tension is to look at the idea of what is the result or what is the purpose of these good works, or the motivation for these good works. Because in chapter 5, when he's talking about them being the light of the world, he says this, he says, "You are the light of the world. Let your light shine before men, that they might see your good deeds." And here's the key part for me, I think, that they might see your good deeds and praise your Father who is in heaven. That they might see your good deeds, but praise your Father in heaven. And then in Matthew chapter 6, he's saying, "Beware of doing your good deeds before men, to be seen and praised by them." Beware of doing your good deeds to be seen by men and to be praised by them. So at the core or the crux of this issue seems to be this idea of what is the result, what is the purpose of these good deeds being seen? Does it lead to us being glorified, or does it lead to God being glorified? Do our good works lead to God's name being honored and lifted up, or does it result in our name being lifted up? And this question really kind of separates and kind of drives a wedge between either being, on the one hand, the light of the world, or on the other hand, being a religious hypocrite. Good deeds that lead to the praise of God, and you're the light of the world. Good deeds that seem to lead to your own glory and own praise, you seem to be a bit of a religious hypocrite. And oftentimes, if you're anything like me, I'm oftentimes just a mixture of the two, and there are always conflicted things going on within me. But it's helpful just to kind of separate those out, just to get a bit more clarity on what Jesus is addressing here. And because Jesus is the true image bearer, because he is the model of true humanity, he is our example. His life is the life that we look to when we want to figure this stuff out a little bit more, what it actually looks like lived out practically, flesh and blood, as it were. And so when we do that, a place to turn that's really helpful in this regard is John's Gospel, because scattered throughout John's Gospel are these little sayings that give us a bit of an insight into the way Jesus lived his life and the motivations for Jesus in the things that he said and in the things that he did. And so beginning in chapter 4, Jesus says this. He says, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to complete the work that he gave me." His food, his sustenance, was to do the will of the Father and to complete the work that the Father had given him to do. John chapter 5, Jesus says, "I do not seek my own will, but I seek the will of the one who sent me." John chapter 6, again, very simply, "I've come down from heaven, not to do my will, but to do the will of the one who has sent me." John chapter 8 has these incredible moments. Jesus says explicitly, "I do not seek my own glory. I honor the Father." He says, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing." That is stunning. Jesus, the eternal Son of God, made man, the incarnation, living and breathing amongst a sinless one. If anybody had kind of reason and justification for kind of being okay with seeking their own glory, it's Jesus. But he says explicitly, "If I seek my own glory, my glory means nothing, nothing." And he goes on to say, "It is the Father who glorifies me." John chapter 12, when Jesus is wrestling in the Garden of Gethsemane between kind of the desires to rescue himself and to not go the way of the cross and obedience to the will of the Father, he says, "Should I then say, 'Father, save me from this hour'?" He says, "No, for this hour is the very reason that I have come." And he goes on to pray this. He says, "Father, glorify your name," constantly looking, constantly pointing towards and wanting to seek out the will and the glory of the Father. In John chapter 17, later on, towards the end of the gospel, as kind of a bit of a bookends, he says this, praying to the Father. He says, "I have glorified you by finishing the work that you gave me to do." At the beginning of the gospel, he says, "My food is to do the will of the one who sent me and to complete the work that he's given me to do." And at the end of the gospel, he says, "I have glorified you by completing the work that you have given me to do." So constantly throughout John's gospel, we are being reminded that Jesus did not come to enforce or to live for his own will or his own glory, but he is constantly pointing away from himself and pointing upwards and back to the Father. His whole life, his teachings, his miracles, his signs, his wonders, his acts of mercy and goodness, everything is this sense of pointing towards something beyond him, back to the glory and the honor of the Father. This is the motivation. This is the heartbeat of Jesus. And paradoxically, it is as Jesus does this, as he relinquishes, as he gives up and kind of empties himself of self-promotion and self-glorification, it's as he does that and points back to the Father, that the Father then in turn glorifies him. It's this kind of Trinitarian love of the Father or the Son honoring and loving the Father, and the Father honoring and loving the Son, this back and forth, this kind of loving self-deference to the other. And in this, I think we get a bit of a kind of an insight into kind of our relationship as well as human beings towards God. It's that we discover our kind of primal, original glory, as it were, as we learn to discover, to give away and to honor God and seek the glory of God, as it were. That is what we are meant to be about. And so I'm going to just pause there, and we're going to go into discussion groups again, and we're going to pick this up in a minute.